By the early 1570s, Elizabeth had triumphed over her opponents in England. She had seen off a rebellion and executed the ringleaders, including her own cousin, the Duke of Norfolk. There was a fragile peace in England, but Elizabeth was in constant danger. She had powerful enemies abroad, headed by the Pope, who, like a 16th century Ayatollah, had signed a fatwa on the Protestant English Queen.
Whosoever sends her out of the world with the pious intention of doing God service, not only does not sin, but gains merit.
Elizabeth had powerful Catholic enemies at home as well. Mary, Queen of Scots, had been Elizabeth's prisoner since her desperate flight from Scotland in 1568. Mary had a strong claim to the English throne through her great-grandfather, Henry VII. On her arrival in England, Mary identified herself passionately with Catholicism. Mary's faith set her on a collision course with Elizabeth, especially as relations between Catholics and Protestants in Europe were about to explode. In Paris, on St. Bartholomew's Day, the 24th of August, 1572, Catholics began a massacre of their Protestant neighbours.
Everywhere there were people who fled, and others who ran after them, crying, "Kill, kill!" There was no mercy, either for age or for sex. It was, in very truth, a massacre. The streets were strewn with naked, mutilated corpses. The river was covered with them.
Sir Francis Walsingham, Elizabeth's ambassador in Paris, barely escaped with his life. The Queen recalled him to London and gave him a new job, masterminding England's security. Walsingham quickly identified public enemy number one.
Nothing is more necessary than that the realm might be delivered of her. If the sore be not salved, I fear we shall have a Bartholomew breakfast.
Mary was a figurehead for Catholics everywhere who wanted to depose Elizabeth. And Mary knew that there could be only one way out of her confinement.
I will not leave my prison, save as Queen of England.
The St. Bartholomew massacre heightened the fear of a bloody Catholic rising in England. It also plunged France into civil war. Elizabeth had relied on France as a counterbalance to the mighty Spanish Empire, which controlled much of Europe, including the Netherlands, that is, modern-day Holland, Belgium and northeastern France. But although England might fear her Catholic neighbours, she couldn't live without them, because in the Netherlands was England's biggest export market, the booming city of Antwerp. Elizabeth had always avoided open war, and she had maintained peace by persuading others to fight her battles for her. But her policy was about to collapse, thanks to events in the Netherlands. At about midday on the 10th of July, 1584, William, Prince of Orange, was dining with his family in the Prinsenhof in Delft. William had already survived several attempts on his life, so by 16th century standards, the security around him was tight. And here in his own house, at least, he should have been relatively safe. At about 2 o'clock, William left the dining room to go upstairs to his study. He was going to meet a recent contact. The man had introduced himself as Balthazar Gerard, a French Protestant, and William had decided to send him to France with letters. He'd given him money to buy clothes for the journey. Balthazar Gerard wasn't a Protestant at all. It wasn't even his real name. Instead, he was an undercover Catholic fanatic, and he'd spent William's money not on clothes, but on pistols. He fired 3 shots at the prince. 2 bullets passed through William's body, and and lodged in the wall. The prince died a few minutes later, uttering as his last words, "God have mercy on my soul and on my poor country." His death was appalling news for Elizabeth. It left her as the only Protestant leader in Europe. Spain could overrun the whole of the Netherlands and then invade England. There was no one left to fight England's battles for her. Elizabeth had no choice. She finally had to send English troops overseas. Her old friend Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, was in command. But still, Elizabeth was wary of declaring all-out war. She discouraged Leicester from going on the offensive. She hoped that a display of English muscle would scare off the Spanish. But Leicester's opponent was the Duke of Parma, Philip's greatest general. For him, England and Spain were at war, and he didn't hesitate to attack. The war put Elizabeth under huge strain. She was now at her most contrary, and things weren't helped by Leicester's mixture of high-handedness and incompetence. In defiance of Elizabeth's explicit instructions, he accepted the Governor-Generalship of the Netherlands, and he proved hopeless as a general as well. So Parma's troops swallowed the Netherlands, bit by bit. Elizabeth recalled Leicester. Her favourite had failed her. Only the sea now stood between England and invasion. There was one person in the kingdom who welcomed the news: Mary, Queen of Scots. In January 1585, Mary was brought here to the hilltop castle of Tutbury in Staffordshire. The assassination of William of Orange abroad and a series of plots in England brought home the danger that Mary presented to Elizabeth's life. So far, Mary had been kept in honourable custody. Now it became a real imprisonment. She had a jailer, the harsh, unsympathetic Puritan, Sir Amias Paulet. There were armed soldiers who patrolled the battlements, and Mary was cut off from all correspondence with the outside world. She was isolated, bored, and resentful. But the devil, in the form of Sir Francis Walsingham, soon found work for Mary's idle hands. Elizabeth's patient spymaster set a trap and then waited for Mary to walk into it. The servant offered to smuggle Mary's letters in a beer barrel from a local brewery. The servant and the brewer were in Walsingham's pay. Every letter she sent or received was intercepted and decoded by Walsingham's private secretary, Thomas Phillips. Six months after the setting up of the barrel post, Mary received a letter from Anthony Babington. Babington came from a rich Derbyshire family. He was young, Catholic, and idealistic, and he'd just organised a plot to assassinate Elizabeth. Babington saw the murder in terms of high heroics. He even had a group portrait painted of himself and his fellow conspirators with the motto, "We are comrades, united in danger." It was intended to be their monument. Instead, it was their tombstone.
Anthony became involved in the plot against Elizabeth mainly due to his connections with Mary, Queen of Scots, while she was imprisoned early on in her life and while he was a young page in her service. We can only believe that he had a crush on her and was infatuated by her, and if not besotted, which carried on for most of his life and her life. Anthony was politically naive. He was very impressionable, and he was used by conspirators who had much stronger beliefs than he had on the wider European front.
Babington wrote to Mary, saying that he and his friends would dispatch the usurper Elizabeth and then rescue Mary. The Spanish would invade, and Mary would take the English throne. Mary's reply, when it came a few days later, was clear enough.
The affair being thus prepared, and forces in readiness within and without the realm, then shall it be time to set the 6 gentlemen to work. Upon the accomplishment of their design, I may suddenly be transported out of this place.
At last, there was evidence enough to send Mary to the scaffold. Babington and his fellow conspirators were arrested a few days later. They were tortured, tried for treason, and sentenced to a traitor's death. Pressure from the country and council was now building up. They were determined to have Mary's head, and Elizabeth was forced to agree to a trial. The trial was to take place at Fotheringhay Castle, and Burghley himself drew up the seating plan. But despite these careful preparations, the trial nearly didn't take place at all. Mary, Queen of Scots, absolutely refused to accept the jurisdiction of the court. "I am not a subject," she said, "and would rather die 1,000 deaths than acknowledge myself as one." Instead, she was a sovereign prince, and so answerable to God alone. Elizabeth retaliated.
"You have in various ways attempted to take my life and bring my kingdom to destruction. I have never proceeded so harshly against you. On the contrary, I have maintained you and preserved your life. It is my will that you answer the nobles and peers of the kingdom as if I were myself present."
Eventually, a form of words was found that enabled the trial to go ahead. Mary defended herself ably in 2 days of examination. She denounced the Babington letters as forgeries, and she managed to wriggle out of the most incriminating questions. But finally, she was cornered. She could only say that she had to be believed because she spoke on the word of a prince. This cut no ice with her judges. The court adjourned to Westminster for the final decision. The verdict, guilty. The sentence, death. Elizabeth now had to decide Mary's fate. The two queens had never met, although Mary had been Elizabeth's prisoner for 20 years. Yet Elizabeth agonized over the decision. She was reluctant to execute Mary because she too was a member of the royal club. Cutting her head off might set a very unwelcome precedent. Elizabeth asked Mary's jailer, Sir Amyas Paulet, to assassinate her by poison or suffocation, so that the Queen would not have to take responsibility for her death. Paulet refused. As Elizabeth hesitated, England seethed with rumours. The Spanish had invaded. London had been burned. Finally, on the 1st of February 1587, Elizabeth signed the death warrant. 7 days later, the sentence was carried out in the Great Hall of Fotheringhay Castle. Mary herself behaved with a theatrical courage. She included Elizabeth in her final prayers. Then her ladies removed her outer clothes to reveal a petticoat of scarlet, the Catholic colour of martyrdom. She knelt at the block, but the executioner bodged his task, and he took 2 strokes of the axe to remove her head. Still worse, when he tried to hold up the head, he found himself clutching only a wig, whilst the head, with its thin greying stubble, rolled at his feet. England celebrated Mary's death. Elizabeth grieved.
Her countenance changed. Her words faltered. She gave herself over to grief, putting herself into mourning weeds and shedding abundance of tears.
What a performance. It was even more complex and self-contradictory than Elizabeth's usual behaviour. Some of those tears were real. Elizabeth had been profoundly reluctant to execute Mary, and when the deed was actually done, she was horrified. But there were also tears of rage. She strongly suspected that she'd been jumped into the action by the council. They'd met secretly and decided not to tell her that the warrant had been dispatched to Fotheringhay. That's why she tore strips off her ministers and Secretary William Davison in particular, who'd actually dispatched the warrant. He was imprisoned, fined, and even threatened with hanging. But finally, there were crocodile tears as well. By exaggerating her grief and scapegoating Davison, Elizabeth was trying to deflect responsibility from where it really and finally lay, with her. The news of Mary's execution exploded across the Catholic world. It gave Philip of Spain the excuse he needed to declare war on the heretic queen.